there's something different about empaths, something rare, something deeply powerful. They don't just listen to words. They feel energy, emotions, and intentions. They love harder, care deeper, and give more than most people ever will. But with that depth comes a silent truth that many fail to understand. There are certain things an empath will never forgive, not because they are bitter, not because they hold grudges, but because they feel everything on a level that most people can't even imagine. You see, when an empath is hurt, it doesn't just pass through them. It stays, it echoes, it transforms them. Every betrayal, every moment of disrespect, every act of emotional dishonesty leaves a mark. And while they may smile, stay quiet, or even walk away peacefully inside, something has permanently changed. This is the truth people often learn too late. You can lose an empath forever, not through one big mistake, but through repeated small ones that show a lack of care. In this speech, we're going to uncover the 6 things empaths never truly forgive, and more importantly, what this reveals about emotional intelligence, boundaries, and self-worth. Because once you understand this, I never see empathy or relationships the same way again. Betrayal of trust hits an empath in a way that is difficult for others to fully understand. It's not just about what happened on the surface, it's about what was felt beneath it. An empath doesn't casually give their trust. They observe, they sense, they read energy long before they open their heart. So when they finally decide to trust someone, it comes from a place of deep emotional certainty. They believe in you not just for who you appear to be, but for who they feel you are at your core. That's why betrayal doesn't feel like a simple mistake to them. It feels like a collapse of something sacred. The connection they believed in suddenly becomes uncertain, and the emotional safety they built begins to crack. They replay moments in their mind not to overthink, but to understand where the shift happened, what changed, what did they miss. Because empaths naturally take responsibility for emotional outcomes, they often turn inward first, questioning their own judgment before blaming someone else. But the truth is, when trust is broken, something deeper than disappointment takes root. It becomes a quiet awareness that even the strongest emotional instincts can be wrong. That realization alone is painful. It challenges their sense of connection with the world. It makes them more cautious, more guarded, even if they don't show it outwardly. The warmth they once gave freely now comes with invisible boundaries. What makes it even more intense is that empaths remember not just the betrayal, but the feeling attached to it. They remember how their chest tightened, how their energy shifted, how something inside them whispered that things were no longer the same. That emotional memory doesn't fade easily. It stays with them, guiding future decisions, reminding them to protect themselves even when they want to trust again. An empath may still choose to forgive on a conscious level. They may understand that people make mistakes, that humans are imperfect, that everyone carries their own struggles. But forgiveness for them doesn't mean forgetting or reopening the same door. It means accepting what happened without allowing it to define their peace. It means moving forward, but with a different level of awareness. And this is where the transformation happens. After betrayal, an empath doesn't become cold. They become selective. They begin to notice patterns they once ignored. They pay attention to consistency, not just words. They start valuing actions over promises. The emotional depth remains, but it is no longer given without discernment. The person who broke their trust may never fully understand this shift. On the outside, the empath may still appear calm, respectful, even kind, but internally access has changed. The openness, the emotional closeness, the unguarded connection, it no longer exists in the same way. Something that once flowed naturally is now protected carefully. This is why betrayal is something an empath never truly forgives in the way people expect. It's not about holding anger or seeking revenge. It's about recognizing that once a certain line has been crossed, the relationship can never return to what it was. The emotional blueprint has been altered, and from that moment on, the empath carries a quiet strength. They understand that their trust is valuable, that their heart is not something to be handled carelessly. They may still love, still care, still show compassion, but they do so with a deeper awareness of who truly deserves a place in their inner world. Emotional M. Manipulation leaves a scar on an empath that goes far beyond ordinary hurt. It's not just about being misled, it's about having their deepest sensitivity used against them. Empaths naturally tune into the emotions of others. They can sense pain, insecurity, and hidden struggles, often before a word is even spoken. This makes them compassionate and understanding, but it also makes them vulnerable to those who know how to exploit that sensitivity. When someone manipulates an empath, it often doesn't happen in obvious ways. It comes subtly through guilt, through emotional pressure, through making the empath feel responsible for things that were never theirs to carry. The manipulator may twist, situations shift blame or create confusion, making the empath question their own perception. And because empaths tend to give people the benefit of the doubt, they may stay longer than they should trying to fix what was never their responsibility. At first, the empath may not even realize what's happening. They feel drained, overwhelmed, and emotionally exhausted, but they can't quite explain why. They begin to overextend themselves, giving more time, more energy, more understanding, hoping that thing will improve. They silence their own needs just to maintain harmony. But deep inside, something feels off. There's a quiet discomfort that grows stronger with time. The moment of realization is powerful. It doesn't always come suddenly. It builds. Patterns begin to reveal themselves. The empath starts noticing how conversations always turn back to the other person's needs, how their own feelings are dismissed or minimized, how they are made to feel guilty for setting even the smallest boundary. And when that clarity finally hits, it changes everything. Because for an empath, manipulation is not just hurtful, it feels like a violation of trust on an emotional level. It's the realization that their kindness was not appreciated but used, that their empathy, which is one of their greatest strengths, was treated as a weakness by someone who chose to take advantage of it. After this awareness, something shifts permanently. The empath no longer engages the same way. They stop explaining themselves to people who refuse to understand. They stop trying to prove their intentions to someone who keeps distorting them. The emotional door that was once wide open begins to close. Not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. They also begin to reconnect with their own inner voice. The same intuition they once doubted becomes their strongest guide. They learn to trust that uneasy feeling, that internal signal that something isn't right, and instead of ignoring it, they act on it. This is where their power truly begins to return. What makes this kind of pain unforgettable is the emotional confusion it creates. Being manipulated forces the empath to question their reality, their judgment, even their own identity in the relationship. And rebuilding that inner clarity takes time. But once it is rebuilt, it becomes unshakable. From that point forward, the empath becomes far more aware of emotional dynamics. They recognize insincerity faster. They notice inconsistencies in behavior. They understand that not everyone deserves unlimited access to their emotional world. And most importantly, they realize that protecting their energy is not selfish. It is necessary. Even if they choose to forgive, they never forget how it felt to be controlled, to be made small, to be emotionally used. That memory becomes a boundary in itself. It reminds them that their empathy is a gift, but only for those who treat it with honesty and respect. Being taken for granted affects an empathy issued in a slow, almost invisible way at first. It doesn't hit all at once like betrayal or manipulation. Instead, it builds quietly over time. An empath gives naturally. They offer support, attention, kindness, and emotional presence without expecting anything in return. For them, caring isn't a transaction. It's who they are. They show up when others need them. They listen without judgment, and they often put someone else's emotional needs ahead of their own without even thinking about it. But the problem begins when this giving becomes expected instead of appreciated. When their effort is no longer noticed, when their presence is assumed rather than valued, something inside them starts to shift. At first, they may ignore it. They tell themselves that it's okay, that not everyone expresses gratitude in the same way. They continue giving, hoping that maybe eventually the other person will recognize what they bring into the relationship. Over time, however, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. The empath starts to notice that they are always the one reaching out, always the one understanding, always the one making space for others. Their needs, on the other hand, remain unseen or unimportant. Conversations revolve around everyone else. Their emotional exhaustion is overlooked, and the worst part is not even the lack of appreciation. It's the feeling of being invisible. This realization is deeply painful because empaths don't give for recognition, but they do need to feel valued. They need to know that their presence matters, that their energy is not being consumed without care. When that acknowledgement is missing, it creates a quiet kind of heartbreak. Not loud, not dramatic, but heavy and constant. As this feeling grows, the empath begins to pull back. Even if it's not obvious at first, they stop giving as much. They become quieter, more reserved. The warmth that once flowed effortlessly starts to fade. They begin to question why they are pouring so much into a space that gives so little in return. And for someone who is used to giving endlessly, this internal conflict can be overwhelming. Eventually, there comes a moment of clarity, a point where they realize that they have been overextending themselves for people who never truly saw them. That their key necessity has been treated like a given, not a gift, and in that moment something changes permanently. The empath doesn't explode or demand attention. They don't create scenes or seek validation. Instead, they simply stop. They stop trying so hard. They stop overgiving. They stop making themselves available in ways that are not reciprocated. And this withdrawal is powerful because it is silent. And then finally, what makes this unforgivable in the heart of an empire is not just the neglect. It's the realization that someone had access to their genuine care and chose not to value it. That kind of awareness stays with them. It reshapes how they show up in future relationships. From that point on, the empath becomes more intentional. They still care, still give, still love deeply, but they pay attention to balance. They notice who reciprocates and who doesn't. They learn to match energy instead of constantly exceeding it, and they understand that their time, their presence, and their emotional support are not things to be handed out freely to those who take them lightly. Even if they forgive the person, they never return to the same level of giving, because once they've felt what it's like to be taken for granted, they refuse to place themselves in that position again. Repeated disrespect doesn't break an empath all at once. It wears them down piece by piece. Unlike others who may react instantly, an empath tries to understand before they react. When someone crosses a boundary or says something hurtful, the empath often pauses and looks deeper. They ask themselves if the person is going through something, if it was unintentional, if they should be more patient. This ability to see multiple perspectives is powerful, but it can also keep them in situations longer than they should stay. At first, they give chances, then they give more chances. They communicate, they explain how they feel, they try to create understanding without conflict. They don't demand perfection. They simply want mutual respect. But when the same behavior keeps repeating, something starts to shift inside them. It becomes clear that this is no longer a misunderstanding. It's a pattern. And patterns speak louder than apologies. Each moment of disrespect, no matter how small, adds weight. It could be being spoken to in a dismissive tone, having their boundaries ignored, feeling unheard in conversation, ends or being treated like their emotions don't matter. Individually, these moments might seem minor to others, but to an empath, they carry emotional meaning. They signal a lack of care, a lack of awareness, or worse, a lack of regard. What hurts the most is not just the behavior itself, but the realization that someone is choosing not to change even after knowing how their actions affect you. That awareness is what makes the pain deeper, because now it's no longer accidental. It feels intentional, or at the very least careless. As this continues, the empath begins to emotionally detach, not out of anger, but out of self-protection. They stop expressing as much. They stop expecting understanding. They start creating space even while still physically present. And often the other person doesn't even notice this shift right away, because the empath has always been the one holding things together. But internally, a line has been crossed. There comes a point where the empath no longer feels the same connection. The emotional bond weakens, not because they wanted it to, but because it has been strained too many times. Respect is the foundation of any meaningful connection. And once that foundation is repeatedly shaken, it can't hold the same weight anymore. When the empath finally decides to step back, It often surprises people because from the outside it may seem sudden, but in reality it has been building for a long time. Every ignored boundary, every dismissive moment, every repeated pattern led to this quiet decision. And when they create distance, they do it with clarity. There's no need for revenge, no need for dramatic endings. The distance itself is the message. It says that they have recognized their worth and are no longer willing to stay in a space which is barren. Here, that worth is not honored. What makes repeated disrespect something they never truly forgive is the accumulation of it. It's not one moment, it's many. It's the memory of how often they chose patience, how often they tried to understand, and how little that effort was matched. That realization stays with them. From that point forward, the empath becomes more firm with their boundaries. They no longer over-explain or justify their need for respect. They understand that the right people won't require constant reminders to treat them well. And if someone shows a pattern of disrespect early on, the empath is far more likely to walk away sooner rather than later. They don't lose their kindness, they refine it. They don't stop caring. They become more selective about where that care goes. And most importantly, they learn that respect is not something to beg for. It is something that must be present from the beginning. Dishonesty affects an empath on a level that goes far beyond the words that were spoken. It's not just about the lie itself, it's about the emotional fracture it creates. Empaths rely heavily on emotional truth. They don't just listen to what people say. They sense alignment, energy, and authenticity. So when someone lies, it creates a deep internal conflict. Something feels off even if the truth isn't immediately visible. At first, the empath may try to ignore that feeling. They may give the benefit of the doubt, convincing themselves that they're overthinking or misreading the situation. They don't want to jump to conclusions, especially with someone they care about. But that intuitive signal doesn't go away. It lingers quietly in the background, creating a subtle distance that wasn't there before. When the truth eventually surfaces, and it always does, it hits differently for an empath. The pain is not just in discovering the lie, but in realizing that their sense of emotional safety has been compromised. They trusted not just the person, but the connection they believed they had, and now that connection feels unstable. What makes dishonesty so difficult for an empath to forgive is the ripple effect it creates. One lie doesn't stay isolated. It makes them question everything. They begin to revisit past conversations, past moments, wondering what else may not have been real. The foundation of trust starts to weaken. And once that foundation is shaken, it's incredibly hard to rebuild it to the same strength. There's also a deeper emotional layer to this. Empaths value authenticity because they offer it so freely themselves. They show up as they are without masks, without hidden agendas. So when someone chooses dishonesty, it feels like a rejection of that openness. It creates a sense of imbalance where one person is being real while the other is holding something back. Even small lies can have a big impact. It's not always about the size of the deception. It's about the intention behind it. To an empath, a lie suggests a lack of expectation for the truth and for the connection itself. It signals that the other person was willing to distort reality instead of being honest. Even when honesty might have been uncomfortable, as this awareness sets in, the empath begins to withdraw emotionally. They may still communicate, still interact, but the depth changes. The openness they once had becomes guarded. They start to hold parts of themselves back, not out of spite, but out of caution. Because once trust is broken through dishonesty, vulnerability no longer feels safe in the same way. Rebuilding that trust is extremely difficult. It requires consistency, transparency, and time. But even then, something is different. The empath may forgive. They may choose to move forward. But the memory of how it felt to be misled doesn't so done. Key disappear. It becomes a reference point, a reminder to stay aware. What makes this unforgivable in a lasting sense is not the act alone, but the emotional impact it leaves behind. It changes how the empath perceives the person. It creates a gap between what they once believed and what they now understand. And that gap is not easy to close. From that point on, the empath becomes even more attuned to honesty. They listen more carefully, observe more closely, and trust their intuition more deeply. They recognize that truth is not just about words. It's about consistency between actions, energy, and intention. They don't stop believing in people, but they become more selective about who they fully trust because they know that emotional safety is built on honesty, and without it, no connection, no matter how strong it once felt, can truly remain the same. A lack of genuine care is something an empath feels almost instantly, even when it's not openly expressed. It's not about grand gestures or constant attention. It's about presence, consistency, and emotional sincerity. Empaths are deeply attuned to effort. They notice who checks in, who listens with intention, who remembers the small details, and who remembers the small details, and who shows up when it actually matters. So when that care is missing, it doesn't need to be announced. They feel it in the silence, in the emotional distance that slowly grows. At the beginning, they may try to compensate for it. They give more, hoping to spark something. In return, they become more understanding, more patient, more present, believing that maybe the other person just needs time or support. This is where an empath often overextends themselves the most. They pour energy into a connection trying to nurture something that isn't being equally sustained. But over time, the imbalance becomes undeniable. The empath starts to notice that their efforts are not being matched, that their emotions are not being held with the same care they offer to others. Conversations may feel one-sided, their struggles may be overlooked or minimized, and even when they express how they feel, it doesn't lead to meaningful change. It creates a quiet realization that they are emotionally alone in a space that was supposed to be shared. What makes this especially painful is that empaths don't ask for much. They simply want to feel seen, heard, and valued. When that basic level of care is missing, it creates a deep sense of emptiness. Not because they depend on others for validation, but because they recognize the absence of something real. There comes a moment when the empath stops trying to fix it, not out of frustration, but out of clarity. They realize that genuine care cannot be forced, requested repeatedly, or built by one person alone. It has to exist naturally, and when it doesn't, no amount of effort can create it. This is a turning point. The empath begins to withdraw, but in a way that is calm and intentional. They stop overgiving, they stop initiating as much, they stop investing emotional energy where it is not being respected or returned. And often this shift goes unnoticed at first, because the other person had grown used to receiving without giving. But for the empath, this is a profound internal decision. It's the moment they choose themselves over a connection that lacks depth. It's the moment they accept that not everyone is capable of offering the kind of care they naturally give. What makes this impossible to truly forgive is the realization that someone had the opportunity to care and chose not to. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't value the connection enough to try. That awareness stays with the empath. It reshapes how they view that person entirely. From that point forward, the empath's far more intentional with their energy. They no longer chase emotional availability. They no longer try to prove their worth through constant giving. Instead, they observe. They watch how people show up without being asked. They pay attention to consistency, not promises. And when they find genuine care, real, mutual, effortless, they recognize it immediately because they know what it feels like when it's missing. They don't become cold or detached. They simply become aligned with their own value. They understand that their empathy is not meant to be wasted on empty connections. It's meant to be shared with those who can meet them with the same depth, the same sincerity, and the same willingness to truly